Hello, and welcome to today's webcast, Increase Board Impact, Clarify Roles and Responsibilities. Before we begin, I am going to play a brief housekeeping video.
Welcome, and thanks for joining. We're pleased to present our continuing professional education webcast series. Before we begin, please keep the following in mind. You can customize how you view our presentation and interact with the presenter. For better viewing, close all other applications and turn up your speaker volume. You can adjust window size and placement or enter full screen mode using the controls at the top right of the window or dragging the bottom right-hand corner to resize. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a series of icons that relate to a different aspect of our session. You can download a PDF of today's slides from the Slide Deck and Handouts widget. You can ask questions by typing in the Q&A window and clicking Submit. We'll do our best to answer all questions or follow up via email. If you experience technical difficulty, refresh your browser by hitting the F5 key. Today's session offers 1 CPE credit. To receive credit, you must meet the National Association of State Boards of Accountancy requirements. You must attend at least 50 minutes of the session and respond to at least 75% of polling questions. To participate in the polls, please check the button next to your answer within the slide window and click Submit. We'll track your progress and alert you when you've earned CPE credit. You can then click the certificate icon in the CPE Progress widget and download your CPE certificate. Don't worry if you can't download your CPE certificate today. We'll email you a copy in 2 weeks. If attending this webcast in a group, you must complete our group CPE attendance sheet, available in our Slide Deck and Handouts widget to receive credit. Please have all group members sign it and send only 1 sheet per group. CPE credit can only be awarded to participants registered as themselves and isn't available for participants who view the on-demand version. This presentation is not legal, investment, or accounting advice. We encourage you to seek the counsel of a professional service provider to apply this content to your specific circumstances.
All right, with that, I'll turn it over to today's presenters to introduce themselves and get our webcast started. Colleen?
Hello, everyone, and happy Thursday. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Colleen Rozillis. I'm a partner with Moss Adams, and I lead our consulting team that covers our public sector, not-for-profit, and tribal industry group. And we're very happy to be here today to talk to you about governance. I'm going to hand it over to Annie Rose to introduce herself.
Thanks, Colleen. I'm Annie Rose Favreau. I'm a director with Moss Adams with the Strategy and Operations team, and I specialize in governance work, doing board facilitation, board development work, as well as organizational assessment, strategic planning for nonprofits and public sector organizations. So I love getting to come in and work with leadership teams, helping to kind of plot the course from point A to point B, and I'm really looking forward to sharing a few more stories and ideas with you all today. So over to you, Etty.
Thank you so much, Annie. So my name is Etty Goldstein. I'm a senior manager at Moss Adams. I have been an auditor for 17 years, and I do specialize in audits for nonprofit organizations. So I'm looking forward to today's discussion. Just talking about these topics are going to be very exciting today, and I will turn it over to Annie.
Fantastic. So before we jump into today's webcast, I did want to first and foremost thank all of you for being here today and point out that this is the first part in a 5-part series, all focused on governance topics. So today we're talking about roles and responsibilities. In August, I'm going to be coming back with my colleague Leanne to talk about board composition, recruitment, and succession planning. So if you're in any of those processes where we're trying to figure out how should our board be structured, how can we make sure that we have new folks coming in, how can we make sure that we're planning if you have any upcoming retirements, that's going to be a really great one for you there. Then our colleagues, Maria and Kinman, are going to be talking about creating inclusive boards and committees in September. So figuring out how can we make sure that our governance structures are actually accessible, inclusive, welcoming, that we have a strong diversity of perspective and background coming into this work to make the decision-making processes as strong as they can be. So that's going to be a great one coming up in September. And then in October, our colleagues Tammy, Chelsea, and Anita are going to be talking about effective finance, investment, and audit committees. These committees can be some of your most critical ones in terms of some of the oversight function that these groups can play. So I think that's going to be a really great one to dig into some of the details there. And then in December, we're closing it out with a panel that's going to be focused on increasing board resilience through diversity, equity, and inclusion. So we're going to be bringing in some of the nonprofit public sector leaders that are doing work in this area and having a great panel discussion on that. So I just wanted to highlight that if you're interested in any of those topics, please do sign up. We'll also have recordings of those as well. So with that, I'm actually going to pass it back to Etty to talk a little bit more about what we're talking through today.
Yes, thank you, Annie. So our takeaways for today is, we're hoping to discuss a more detailed definition to those essential roles and responsibilities of a board, describe key elements of a healthy relationship between the board and management, and as well as to identify some actionable strategies to help boards clarify roles and improve collaboration between each other. So with this, I believe I'm going to pass it to Colleen now to get us started.
Before we get started, Laura's going to run a poll.
Yes, perfect. Polling question number 1. What is your role in your organization? A, board member. B, committee member. C, executive director or CEO. D, management. E, staff. S, other/not applicable. I'll give everyone a few moments to respond. To participate, please click the button next to the answer you choose and hit submit.
It's always nice to know a little bit more about the crowd that we're working with here. So we appreciate you filling out this first question so that we can tailor a little bit more of the discussion around who all is here.
Definitely. Okay, and we'll give people just a few more seconds to respond. And here are the results.
All right, so we have a lot of folks in the board support realm here in terms of executive directors, management, and staff. So that's great. We'll make sure to cover things that we can do in terms of the board staff partnership and managing up. And for the board members in the room, thank you for attending as a fellow board member. That feels nice. All right, so let's get into roles and responsibilities. This is one of the areas where it sort of feels like we join boards or we onboard folks and we don't even really talk about it. You think you understand what a board member does, and in fact, this is an area that causes the most tension when we don't have that clear understanding. So we always like to cover just kind of those baseline things. Governance is not just about how a board operates, it's the strategic framework of the organization, it's your policies and procedures, it's your operating structure. And what governance ultimately does is ensures that leadership, which includes the executive director or CEO and themselves, makes good decisions and delivers on the organization's mission. And that is a really broad range of activities, but ultimately what we're thinking about is how can we be accountable to our constituency, whoever that looks like, and really stand behind delivering on our mission, and what steps do we need to take to make sure that that actually happens. When we don't have clear roles and responsibilities, when board members don't know what they're doing or the staff doesn't know exactly what the board's role is, the number one thing that happens is that we waste a lot of time. We waste time in meetings, we waste time preparing for meetings, following up meetings with problems, or in between meetings. We also can often have board members just not be engaged. They can leave the organization because they're not engaged and don't understand what they're supposed to do. Maybe they thought they were going to be brought on as a technical expert. Maybe they thought they were going to be brought on for a certain type of advocacy or fundraising or to represent a certain community, and that doesn't happen. And so we have turnover. We'll also have turnover on the management side as a result of that. If a board is way too in the weeds and micromanaging or going around the executive to go to staff, that can be a place that causes a lot of turnover. We'll often also see sort of dysfunction that we that we wouldn't normally see in a high functioning organization when board members don't know their roles because they can have interpersonal conflicts or challenges with staff by not understanding exactly where their space is and staff space is. And sometimes that can be really challenging. I think that's also very common on an elected or appointed board where folks aren't coming necessarily from that place of, okay, we recruited you, but they are elected or appointed. And so their vision of what the board might be is a little bit different. We also often see that strategy shifts pretty fast, and that can also waste time and waste energy if we don't stick to a strategic plan, if boards don't know their role in terms of delivering on the legacy of prior boards. Sometimes a big strategy shift is important, but other times that can be very challenging for an organization to constantly pivot and can cost a lot of time and money anyway. And ultimately that means we're not progressing toward what we want to do because we're spending our time on things that we shouldn't be and really should be focused on delivering on our mission. So when we think about the clear responsibilities of a board, we think about kind of 4 areas. So one is establishing that strategic framework. That's the mission, the vision, and the values of the organization. That's really important for the board to define, to uphold over time, and if it needs to shift it. Typically during that strategic planning process, every 3 to 5 years, you're taking a fresh look at your vision and your values and your mission and saying, does this still represent who we are? Is this the direction we're still going? And that's the main legacy of the board. And that's where the accountability comes in as well, is are we actually delivering on that? Are we looking at our operational and financial performance? Are we tracking our goals and KPIs toward delivering on that mission? Are we living up to our values? Do we need to change things? The board also sets the strategic direction. So we think about setting those high-level goals, essentially deciding the what are we going to do, and moving forward on implementing any policies that are important to deliver on that. And then finally, this is something that can get forgotten by board members especially I would say in an elected way. We see this a lot in school boards and other elected boards where goodwill and support is really important. Once you become a board member, you're a member of the leadership team. You may be interested in serving on a board because you are interested in changing that organization, but you still have to approve the budget. You still have to drive the strategic plan. You still have to be supportive of staff and management to get to the goals that they want to achieve, that you and the organization want to achieve. And so being a representative in the community, being a representative to stakeholders, there's often an advocacy or fund development piece in terms of being a board member. Goodwill and support is really important to a strong board and to feeling really comfortable in your role as well. So I mentioned on the prior slide that the board really decides the what. I think this is a place in the board staff partnership that there can often be tension, is that the board sometimes wants to get into that how, wants to get into this is how we're doing this. And I think this is very common in a not-for-profit board where we have folks with a lot of experience in nonprofit. And so when you see folks delivering in a way that hasn't been your experience or isn't how you would do it, it can be really easy to get into operations. It can also be really easy to get in operations if you're a finance or audit committee member and you want to see kind of beyond the financial statements at the transactional detail, which is your right, which is fiduciary responsibility, but it also can be a challenge for staff to understand what's your role. Can you direct me in this? Can you not? And so that's really important to understand, to be very clear from both the staff side and from the board side. And I know we have mostly staff and management here in this webcast, so I would say sharing this type of framework and making sure that you are setting really clear boundaries on here's what you wanted me to do, here's our progress, here's the data that supports it, and trying to reinforce those boundaries through providing that information very clearly can be a very valuable tool for you as you move forward. So roles and responsibilities are going to be really different from board to board, and often it depends on size. We see smaller boards be more working boards, sometimes being very focused in terms of helping with grant making, doing very direct fundraising and community engagement, and they can be engaged in programs as well. One thing that every board is engaged in is strategic planning, and then ethics and compliance. Every board is also engaged in that. When you become a medium-sized organization, we see the formation of board committees. Even a small board might have a finance committee or an executive committee, but as you get bigger, There's the opportunity to do standing committees as well as ad hoc committees. So we might see a strategic planning committee form every several years to update or formulate that plan. We also would want to see the board get a little bit more focused on things like risk and impact and outcomes, because we want to see that board level up a little bit more into that policy and strategy realm if you're not going to be as much as a working board. And if you are a large size board, I, for the last 2 years, was the chair of a 27-member board. So I lived this world, and it can be pretty challenging to make sure people are engaged, but also make sure that we're putting people to work in the right way. And so there's a real focus on what board leadership looks like. You have to have a strong executive committee. You have to have strong board development in order to keep people engaged. And you're likely more focused on kind of that outward advocacy, strategic partnerships, and you do have to very much focus on board development, because you're going to have, as part of that larger board, you're going to have people who are going to come on with very different levels of expertise and different viewpoints, and making sure that you are all aligned in the direction that the board is going is much more challenging on a large board. So when we think about boards and being in the place where it's most effective, there are kind of two main dysfunctions when we don't understand our roles and responsibilities. I've talked a lot about when boards are too in the weeds, too operational. I think my best example is I've worked with a board where they have a member who every month asks for the credit card receipts of every single staff member and wants to look through each transaction. That is too in the weeds, and that is not a valuable use of time. But then we also have boards that really are kind of checked out, or they're just kind of a rubber stamp board, and that's not valuable either. That can cause a lot of apathy among staff, among the executive. That's also an area that's ripe for ethics challenges if you don't have enough insight on outcomes and you're not checking in on what's actually happening. So what we really want is that space in between. We want you to be engaged, understand what's happening operationally, and really focus on outcomes and focusing on that organizational strategy. That's the sweet spot in that Venn diagram. And I'm going to hand it over to Annie Rose to talk a little bit about a case study.
Yeah, thank you so much. So now that we've talked a little bit, given that overview of general roles and responsibilities that we typically see, we wanted to share one that I think is a really, really common example that we see, where in this case, this was a board that really wanted to be in the weeds all of the time, basically. So in this instance, it was a medium-sized nonprofit. The board had been, was sort of transitioning out of being more of an operational board into more of a policy governance board, is professionalizing its processes, is in the process of maturing and kind of trying to get to that next step. But in this case, the executive director, they were just having really, really a lot of difficult challenges getting the board to actually transition into a more strategic role. The board really, really wanted to stay in that operational place. There were many members of the board who were executive directors in their own right of their own organizations. And so they were really used to functioning in that kind of management capacity. And so this was creating, while there was, I think, really goodwill on all sides, this was still creating tension between the board and the executive director. And when we came into this situation, this was one of the challenges that they said, we want to have a really strong relationship here, but we're running into this issue. How can we make sure from the management perspective that we're helping the board level up? And how can we make sure from the board level that we're really operating at the right place? So in this case, what they decided to do and what we helped facilitate was a board retreat specifically focused on this topic. So as part of that work, coming in and really saying, what are the roles and responsibilities, sharing sort of a little bit more in depth, similar information to what we've just shared around here's what we would typically see for an organization of your size in terms of what the board is actually doing and is responsible for. The group also, though, spent quite a bit of time establishing group norms. And these were norms both in terms of how the board members wanted to treat each other, but also some group norms about how the board wanted to be treating and working with the executive director and vice versa. So they said, in general, if we have a conflict, this is what we expect from each other. If we have challenges, this is what we expect from each other. And then, and I think that this was the kind of turning point for this group, we walked them through some scenarios to actually think through, okay, if this issue came up, let's pretend this is happening. How would we use the group norms that we just established to actually work through this together. And I think that gave them a lot of more practical tools than just theoretically thinking about what are those roles and responsibilities, because it allowed them to really identify and say, oh yeah, I've been in that position. How do we want to approach this? And it helped the group identify where there are areas where everyone was really well aligned, everyone was on the same page, and some of the areas where there were actually quite different responses to the scenarios that were brought up. So that was a very helpful tool, again, to try and get some more alignment coming through with the group. They also, and we'll talk about this a little later on when we're talking about some of the board development that can be used to help enhance roles and responsibilities, but they also incorporated the topic of roles and responsibilities into their board self-assessment. So this was something that they've decided, we're going to look at this on at least an annual basis for this team and really have a conversation about how well are we doing? How well do we think that we're doing in this area, so that there was a natural kind of touch point built into their annual processes. And I think having both of these tools, the retreat and the self-assessment, first and foremost, it opened up lines of communication. So it just made it a little bit easier to say, okay, we've been talking about this topic. If a challenge comes up in this area, we can reference that because now we have some shared language around it. It also really helped to clarify that everybody was wanting the board to function at its highest and best use. Even when the board members individually were kind of getting into the weeds on stuff, everybody was really on board with the concept of we would like to be using our board time as effectively as possible. So coming out of this, I think that they had quite a few more internal tools and those group norms so that when issues and challenges came up, they had something to fall back on, and it didn't have to feel like a personal issue. They had the context to say, this is a group issue that we're working through together, that we're learning and developing and growing over time. So it was really nice to see these tools kind of come into play at this really important moment for this board as they were taking that next step to really mature and professionalize a lot of their operations. So that's just one example. We'll share a couple other case studies as we go through. But with that, I think we have our next polling question.
All right, great. Yes, polling question number 2. What is your board's biggest challenge with roles and responsibilities? A, training or education or lack of knowledge. B, desire to get overly involved in operations. C, desire to be too hands-off. D, lack of alignment or agreement about roles. E, all of the above. As a reminder, if you would like to receive CPE credit for today's webcast, you will need to respond to at least 3 of the 4 polling questions.
So Colleen and Etty, what do you feel like you see most commonly in this area? I feel like, as I've been talking about, the desire to get overly involved in operations is a really common one that comes up on this list, but I'm curious what you both are seeing out there too.
I would agree with that as well. That's typically what I see on majority of the boards. They just want to be micromanaging, very involved on everything that's happening with the organization.
I think training can be a big piece. A lot of boards provide very good onboarding training and then not continual education. And onboarding can be just a deluge of information. It goes right past you. I think particularly financial and budget information. I've worked with a lot of arts and culture organizations, and for better or for worse, they really will rely on the finance committee for things like the annual audit or the 990. And then we really want to make sure that folks understand what they're signing off on when they approve that, right? So providing regular education on good governance, that's an area that we see big gaps, but also huge opportunities with a very small investment to improve the board.
All right, great. Let's see the results.
You had it nailed, Colleen. Look at that. Lots of training and education coming through here.
10 points.
Yep, as well as all of the above. So this is great. And I believe over to you, Etty, to take us through our next section here.
Perfect. Okay, so let's talk about working with management. As we all know, working with management is going to be crucial when serving as a board member. Management is a key component of any organization, and they're responsible for making those operational decisions, operational policies, and keeping the board informed about current conditions, as well as bringing recommendations that will further improve the organization. So how do we better work with management? So this can be done by setting those regular check-ins between the executive officer and the board chair. It is also important to maintain that open and consistent communication channels between, again, the executive officer and the board chair, building those strong relationships. Having those strong working relationships will also help when it comes to discussions related to any issues and challenges before they become a problem for the organization. And these strong relationships and continuous discussions also translate in no surprises for both the management, those executive officers, and the board. So sharing openly and honestly, especially when those discussions are related to bad news or problems or concerns, will help further improve trust as well and setting the tone with the rest of the board members. And the board is able to make the best decisions for the organization when they're properly informed. Another important item is related to the board responsibility to annually evaluate the executive officer's performance. This should be done thoughtfully and honestly. This feedback will help providing direction and clear expectations on performance. And equally important, the board must assess its own performance, which shows, again, like commitments and shared leadership responsibilities. So I mentioned the importance of establishing that healthy relationship with the executive office. And therefore, I want to focus a little bit more on what to take into consideration when selecting the executive officer. And this, of course, will depend on the size and composition of the board of directors. However, it is very common to see that the board will establish either an internal search committee or even engage a search firm to get those best candidates. And when doing this search, it is a great idea just to review the mission and vision of the organization, as well as establishing clear and specific characteristics, skills, style, and any other needs that are very tailored or are tailored to the organization. And we suggest that you are also clear on those established expectations, goals, priorities, and supervision hierarchy. So because you want to make sure that the executive officer will be fully on board with the organizational objectives. So now that we have an executive officer, how do we support them from a board position? And some of these might seem pretty straightforward, but they are very important to establish that strong and healthy relationship. So I previously mentioned one of the main actions to establish those strong relationships come from frequent and honest communication. And it is important to provide frequent feedback, which must be assessed fairly, and do not resort to oversimplified checklists or rating scales, and make sure to encourage and complement exceptional initiatives. Everyone appreciates a boost of confidence when things are going well. Another way to supporting the executive officer is by introducing them to key community leaders. This will create and open and create better opportunities to continue supporting the organization, to fundraising activities, and or opportunities to improve the organization's visibility and participation in the community. So overall will be a positive impact for the executive officer, for the board member relationships, and the community as well. And so I went over about helping selecting the best executive officer for your specific organization and how to better support them. So now I want to discuss those next best practices when it comes to evaluating the executive officer. And it takes me back to making sure that the executive is clear on those goals and expectations from the beginning, as the board should review their performance against those established goals. And we've all heard about SMART goals. I just want to remind that this SMART, it's just, these goals must be specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and within a time bound. So you can actually evaluate those goals in a very fair manner. Vague goals that lack clarity are often left undone, even if they're great potential. Another key item is for the board to discuss the executive compensation on a frequent basis. This is recommended to be in a biannual basis to ensure that this is fair, that the compensation is still fair and competitive with the market. And the board should understand, and this was mentioned before, but the board should understand the details of those compensation packages and public records like the 990 tax form or the W-2s that should include also this compensation information. Embracing every opportunity to show your leadership and don't shy away from uncomfortable and or difficult discussions. Again, the more discussions, the more conversation, the more clarity that it is between management and the board, the better decisions are going to be taken for the organization as an overall. So with this, I'm going to turn it over to Colleen to discuss our second case study.
Thank you. So this case study is about a board that is fully elected and appointed and not so essentially the management and staff have absolutely no idea who is going to be on the board. It changes frequently based on elections, based on resignations, and it also is a really high profile organization. It's a joint powers authority, and so there's a lot of eyes on what the board does, decisions that they make, and there's a tremendous amount of work that has to be done to onboard board members in this type of an environment. So it's a really, really interesting opportunity to dig into leadership and effectiveness across the board. So on this particular board, because it was a joint powers authority, there were in the bylaws descriptions of exactly who would serve on the board. So each jurisdiction that was a member of the board had one staff member, typically the utility director or another technical specialist, and then one elected official, sometimes the mayor, sometimes a member of city council, would also serve on the board. So as you can imagine, depending on election cycles, those folks may turn over. Institutional knowledge would walk out the door all the time. On the technical specialist side, it wasn't as often that folks would turn over, but they're also technical specialists. And so they were really focused on the individual operations, what was happening at a very detailed level. You had this very interesting mix of folks who were very high level, trying to represent their community and really thinking about policy, and then folks who really wanted to dig in the weeds and talk about engineering. And so board meetings could go off the rails really quickly, and it was a ton of work on the part of the manager and staff to really understand what do board members need to be able to make strong decisions and to deliver on their strategy. They also had a very ambitious strategy. So many utilities across the country are focused on reducing their carbon impact. And so this organization was no different. And that's a huge lift for them, a lot of investments, a lot of big decisions. And it was something that they had to focus on. And they very much struggled in terms of how do we align? How do we really focus our time and energy? So what happened with this particular entity is that they leveraged a strategic planning process to be able to align their current board. And actually during that process, a number of board members changed over based on folks taking new jobs and based on another person being appointed from one of their jurisdictions, a different elected official. But using that strategic planning process and getting folks aligned on kind of that big picture, who are we? What are our values as an organization? What's not going to change about us in terms of our vision was a really critical piece in terms of getting them aligned and getting them focused. The other thing that they did was they started implementing really consistent board education, understanding that onboarding itself, particularly for the elected officials who were also getting the fire hose of being onboarded to their new positions, was really important to do. And so they provided consistent education. They kind of bit off pieces and really focused on that shared governance piece. What is the language that we all speak? How consistent can we be? They also leveraged the consulting team to meet with each board member one-on-one and just hear from them. What's important to you? What do you need? In a way that was very neutral. So sometimes you can take a member of staff, sometimes the executive can do this. Other times it's really helpful to have a third party, whether it's a partner or stakeholder, or whether it's someone in a position like us, to be able to just have that totally neutral discussion and figure out what do board members need without it necessarily being charged with the, okay, you're evaluating me, or this is a relationship that might not feel comfortable because of the power dynamic. And then they took that back to the board in an anonymized way and said, here are the lenses everyone is looking through, right? So we're looking through, okay, we're representing our constituents, or we're looking through, I'm very much focused on the long term. Climate change is the most important thing to me, and so this is what I'm focused on. And got folks to simply understand we're all coming from different viewpoints, but we're all focused on delivering that exact same mission to the folks that we represent. And then there was the opportunity to really try to open those lines of communication between board and staff, as opposed to feeling like there were individual conversations and relationships between board and staff, really trying to make them feel like a whole team. So there was a retreat that was held that focused on aligning around those shared goals specifically. And very much keeping folks at that policy and strategy level. Anytime things got into operations, there was a timeout. Let's set that aside and talk about that at a future meeting. Let's really focus on our shared goals. And the result of that were a couple of things. So a strategic plan that had very clear goals that folks could be aligned around, and that we could attach initiatives, the budget, specific actions to a very strong understanding from the folks who were in the room of why they would have challenges, because it was because of the very specific viewpoints they were coming from. And so that could help them, even as folks turned over in the board, really hold on to that as their culture, that it wasn't about interpersonal conflicts, that it wasn't about any inherent challenges. It was the nature of the board that would cause some of their issues, and that we could get over it by really working together to align around the goals. The relationship with the board and the general manager did get stronger, and part of that was those really strong boundaries and goals that they had set up. And then giving each other just that space of understanding we're all coming from different perspectives, but when we're here, we've got to put our board hat on for this organization. And the general manager felt much more supported as a result of that. And then going forward, they had more focused meetings because they focused those, again, around those goals. I also want to put in a plug for using the strategic plan in terms of decision making. So you can make a strategic plan that you think covers every single aspect of your organization, and then within 2 months something is going to come up that's not in the plan. So what do we do with that? We use the mission, vision, and values to really help to make those decisions. So we say, are we achieving our mission? Are we helping to get closer to our vision? Are we actually living our values with this decision, whether it's a potential opportunity through a grant or a partnership? If it's not aligning with the values, if it's not going to help us achieve our mission, then we should really have a conversation about whether we should do it. And it's hard to say no. I think in the nonprofit space, in the academic or government space, when we have grants available to us, that can be a real challenge to then walk away from an opportunity, particularly if there are dollars attached. But if it doesn't align and is going to cause you mission creep, or is going to take up staff time that could be better used to serve the mission, then really ground in those values and practice being able to say no and just focus on the mission. And that's something that this organization did as part of that process. And when we check up on them, it seems like it's going well. They do continue to have turnover depending on, again, those things that are out of their control. So it's the job of those board members and the job of staff to, again, do that training and education, that very consistent onboarding and reinforcement of who we are, and this is our board culture. All right. And we're going to hand it back to Laura to do another poll.
All right, great. Polling question number 3. How would you characterize your organization's current board/management partnership? A, great, there is good collaboration. B, okay, there are opportunities for improvement. C, challenging, this is an area of growth. D, I have no idea. For those of you that would like a copy of today's slide deck, you can download them from the folder that says slide deck and handouts. We will also be sending the slides via email after the webcast. All right, and we'll give everyone just a few more moments to respond. And here are the results.
Well, these are really good results. More than a third of folks saying there's good collaboration. Good for you. So then you can just build upon that, which is awesome.
Fantastic. All right. Well, for those of you who say there are opportunities for improvement, I'm hoping that this next section will be useful for you, because the last piece that we wanted to talk about was thinking about developing board skills. Colleen was just talking through, and Etty was mentioning as well, a lot of opportunities to make sure that you're doing board education and development on an ongoing basis. And we definitely wanted to highlight this topic because it can so often play a role in helping to both establish and reinforce really strong roles and responsibilities, and making sure everybody is on the same page around what those things look like. So high functioning boards always take time to develop their members. In terms of when we think about board education, there's some common topics that our team is seeing pretty frequently coming up for a lot of the groups that we're working with right now, especially those within mission-driven organizations. And if you're interested in any of these topics, I will say, please also reach out after the webcast. We have some really great resources on all of these areas. But first and foremost, good governance practices. So just generally, what is a board meant to do? How are we working together? A lot of the elements that go into roles and responsibilities, that is certainly something that comes up. And I think it was mentioned previously, but ideally, this isn't something that you just kind of run down a list once when you're onboarding folks, but really this is something that you can come back to on a continual basis as well. Fiduciary responsibility, depending on the type of organization that you work within and the composition of your board. You might have a board that is very, very comfortable with finances, very comfortable taking on that fiduciary responsibility. They understand what that means. And then there's other boards where this is going to be absolutely new information for most of the members of your board. And that's the time when we want to make sure that this knowledge isn't just living within your finance committee, that this is something that is actually being shared across the full group as well. Risk management, this is an interesting one that comes up quite a lot. And this, to me, is a fascinating topic because the word risk can mean many, many different things to many different people depending on their background, especially depending on their professional background. So if you think about somebody maybe who's trained within the healthcare space, they're going to think of risk in a very, very different way than someone who's trained maybe within an arts and culture space. So a lot of times what we find is that the concept of risk management is something that people can be bringing a lot of unspoken assumptions into the room around this topic. So this can be a really great area to get into it and make sure everybody's on the same page here, and also really have a strong understanding of what is the board's role in managing, recognizing, and helping to mitigate against risks to the organization. And some of that comes into the strategic planning world as well, but a lot of times having specific conversations about risk can be very helpful, again, to kind of uncover some of those unspoken ideas that people are bringing to the table. Diversity, equity, and inclusion. This is a really major one. As I mentioned before, we have some upcoming webcasts focused on this topic in particular, but really thinking about both. Sometimes this is at the board level in terms of how are we incorporating DEI practices into our work. And then sometimes this is about what it looks like within the organization. How are we incorporating this into the services that we provide? And sometimes that gets a little bit more into the operations, but this is a good moment because ideally anything that's showing up in your operations is also coming from the strategic direction from the board themselves. And then finally, environmental, social, and governance, so ESG reporting. This is an interesting topic because for a lot of the clients that we work with in the nonprofit space, in the public sector space, ESG really comes out of some of the private industry space where we're trying to understand How well are we doing as an organization, especially as we're reporting out to shareholders? But what we're finding is that this, as a framework, how well are we doing in terms of environmental impact, social impact, good governance? This is a framework that can be incredibly useful for really any type of organization, and it's a framework that is being used more consistently. So this is another area that we're seeing a lot of boards kind of dig into, saying, what is our role here? And obviously governance is called out specifically within this. So there's a lot for boards to be able to really kind of dig into there and get a better understanding of what does good governance really look like, especially in relation to some of these other really critical topics like environmental and social impact. So again, we could talk about all of these for a long time, but I wanted to highlight some of the most common ones because I think that these are ones when you're thinking about how can we be helping to clarify roles and responsibilities, all of these topics can help you get to that place. The other area I wanted to highlight here was board decision-making capacity. This is a very common area for development. How do we make decisions together, and how can we make decisions in a more effective way? Making good decisions is a primary responsibility of the board. It might be the primary responsibility of any group like this, but we often don't conceptualize of this as a specific set of skills. We often instead are running into some of the symptoms of a lack of well-developed decision-making capacity. So if your board spends a lot of time discussing topics, especially if some of those topics are not super critical, that might be a symptom of this. If your board wants tons of information from staff. I'm sure many of the staff members on this call can attest to a time when you have had a request to bring just a huge amount of information back to the board, but then they're not actually doing anything with that information. That's another symptom that there's something broken in that decision-making process. Or if the board is even getting into arguments or can't resolve interpersonal conflicts, a lot of times when we haven't developed the decision-making capacity, it can come out and look like interpersonal issues when really it's about we haven't figured out how to do this well together as a group. So this can be a really helpful way of framing this to your board, especially if you are from the staff perspective seeing some of those issues come up. This can be helpful to say, instead of saying, wow, you all are not doing this very well, you must get better at it, instead being able to say, let's strengthen our decision-making capacity. Here's some of the ways that we can do that. And so this is one where there's so many different ways to build decision-making capacity here. Sometimes this is really about working with a group around, what information do you actually need in order to make a decision? What are the criteria that we are using to make a decision? Sometimes this is around really making sure that you have strong conflict resolution skills so that when you have a lack of consensus, what do you do with that as a group? And some of this too is about kind of recognizing, I think Colleen mentioned putting on your board hat. When are we putting on the board hat and kind of coming to this conversation from the high level strategic board perspective? And when might we be coming to these conversations from a really individual perspective, an individual lens? And sometimes so it's just even reminding the group, yes, we need to be, coming to this work as a member of a team, not just as individuals. So again, lots of different ways to do that, but this can be a really important topic to bring forward if you have some of those challenges in terms of board operations that might be getting in the way of the board really fulfilling on its role. Another element that we mentioned, this is one of my absolutely favorite tools, to have a board actually go through a self-evaluation process on a regular basis. Usually this happens at least once every 2 years. Some boards do this annually, but we want it to be something fairly regular. But it gives the board an opportunity to step back and just give a moment of self-reflection. And I think it's really important to note this is self-evaluation. So this is every individual member of the board filling out an evaluation that says, this is my perception of how well we are doing as a board, how well we are showing up for each other and fulfilling on our roles and responsibilities. And this can be especially helpful if you might not have consensus on your board about what the issues actually are that are preventing the board from maybe doing its best work together. And one of the topics that you can really highlight here within the assessment is how well are we fulfilling on our roles and responsibilities? Do we have a clear understanding of this? Do we feel like we're doing a good job? Or are there areas that we would like to have additional support and resources? This can be a really great source to get information about what type of ongoing education would be really helpful for this group. One thing I'll also note is that some groups, if you have a really high trust group, I would say this can be something that the self-assessment can be done just by the board itself. If you have some more challenges within the group, it can be really helpful to get an outside facilitator to both administer the self-assessment and then also compile the results in a useful way that's going to help produce a really engaging and productive conversation. So that's something to think about too. I think we've seen this done very well under both models, but sometimes it can be helpful to have that outside eye just to make sure that it feels like a neutral process as well. So then the very last piece I think I have here to cover is onboarding new members. This has come up really throughout the conversation today, but we want to be thoughtful about if you don't invest in onboarding at the front, you're going to spend more time later on down the road in terms of catching your new board members up. And honestly, developing onboarding materials is one of the most interesting things because it can be a very revealing exercise, because it also shows you where do we have organizational gray areas, where are things really, really clear, where are we communicating our story really well, and where might there be open gaps too. So I think that this can be a really, putting together onboarding can be a really beneficial thing, both for the board members who receive it, but also for the staff that are involved and engaged in putting this together. We've listed a lot of the most critical topics that typically come up as part of onboarding, but I think in terms of roles and responsibilities, this is obviously a prime area where you can highlight this is what we expect of our board members, this is what we expect from you at kind of that big picture strategic level, but this is also what we expect from you in terms of how many meetings are you coming to, some of those logistical roles and responsibilities too. And then the only other piece I would love to focus on here is the board buddy opportunity. It's right at the bottom of the list, but this can be very helpful where you basically take an incoming board member, pair them up with a more veteran board member so that the new person coming into the group not only has someone that they can always go to if they have questions, but it's also the more veteran board buddy can also be sharing a lot of contextual information with that new member. It can sometimes be very challenging if you're coming into a really well-established board to really engage in the work quickly. And having the board buddy is one of the really great ways in order to be able to do that. So want to give a plug for all the fantastic board buddies out there as well. And then I'm going to close us out with our final case study here today. This one highlights some of those pieces I was talking about in terms of onboarding. You're working with, this is medium-sized foundation board. They had a few very, very long-term members who had a lot of institutional knowledge, and then they had a very large crop of new members that were coming in as well. And they had not really established a standardized onboarding process. Typically, it had really been the last person in the role kind of handed over to the next person. They might have a conversation, but it was very informal, very ad hoc. They didn't have a regular training schedule either. So what this resulted in, it was that a lot of times as they were coming into those decision-making processes, things really slowed down because they were trying to catch all of the new board members up to what is actually happening within the organization. What are the impacts of this decision? What is our decision to make versus a management decision to make? So it was just slowing everything down as part of that process. And it made a lot of the new members feel like this was a disjointed process, that they didn't feel really connected to the group, that they were often confused about what am I supposed to be doing in this conversation? How am I meant to be contributing? So everybody recognized we'd like to make a shift in this situation. What can we do about that? So they went through a process of putting together a more structured board onboarding piece where they had a timeline. And I will say this wasn't highly complex. This was pretty straightforward. There were 4 moments where they had a specific meeting with the executive director, a specific meeting with their board buddy. They had one session where all new members were getting together and going through some of the history of the organization, and a session where they were going through some of the financial elements with the treasurer as well. So it wasn't, I'm not talking something super, super in-depth, but it was structured and everybody knew what the structure was. The other piece of that, as I mentioned, was establishing, they put together these board buddy relationships and really focused on making sure that the buddy was one of the primary ways that they were going to make sure that there was knowledge transfer that was happening between those veteran board members and the newer board members coming in, as well as just establishing some relationships, right? Actually walking into a room where you can see one person that you know, I can go sit next to this person, they're going to help me through this meeting, can be incredibly helpful just on a person-to-person level. So they put that in place. They did also roll out a self-evaluation to say how well are we doing so that they could continue to iterate on this process over time. And they also did some really thoughtful social events. They knew that people were really busy. We don't have a lot of time to socialize with one another, but they had a few very, very targeted events where they were bringing together their board to not talk about work, to just get to know each other better so that those conversations could be a little bit smoother moving forward. And I would say they found that even with a fairly minimal onboarding process, it made a really significant difference in the experience of the new members coming in and helping new members get up to speed quickly so that they could actually engage with the board work very quickly and jump in and be really, productive members of the team as well. So that's always exciting to see. And I would say just some small changes right at the beginning of this work really improved this for the group overall. So with that, I think we are on to our final polling question here.
All right, great. Yes, polling question number 4. What areas of continuing education would be most useful to your board? A, good governance practices. B, effective meeting management. C, fiduciary responsibilities. C, risk management. E, diversity, equity, and inclusion. S, ESG reporting. Once you have completed all CPE requirements, you will be able to download a PDF of your CPE certificate from the CPE progress window. Also, a reminder, feel free to submit any questions in the Q&A box on your console.
And we've been seeing some great questions come through. I don't think that we will probably have a lot of time to answer any of those questions, but we will do our very best to follow up with any of you who have put questions in the chat as well so that we can make sure we get those answered for you if we don't have enough time right here at the end.
Okay, great. We'll give everyone just a few more moments to respond. And here are the results.
Fantastic. So it looks like we have quite a good spread here between some of the areas. In starting top to bottom, I think we've listed them, it looks like almost in their most popular order. So well done on whoever put this question together. But not surprised to see some of these pieces. Good governance as the kind of baseline, effective meetings, that can be a huge, huge element in terms of what makes the board experience a positive experience, is whether your meetings are set up in such a way as to be useful for everyone. And then coming down here, fiduciary and risk management are the next most popular. All right, so as I said before, I don't think that we have time to answer any of the excellent questions that have come through, but we will certainly follow up with you who have submitted directly via email after this session. But we really wanted to thank you all for being here today, for sharing questions and comments as they came through. And I think with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Laura to close us out.
All right, great. Thank you, Colleen, Annie, Rose, and Etty, for a great webcast today. Like she said, if we didn't have time to answer your questions, we will do our best to follow up with you after the webcast. Feel free to reach out to any of our presenters if you have additional questions. We also invite you to visit our website for more resources and information on this topic, many of which are linked in your handouts window. Also, as Annie Rose mentioned, be sure to join us for our next webcast in our Building Better Board webcast series, Board Composition, Recruitment, and Succession Planning, which will be hosted August 20th at 10 a.m. Pacific Time. If you click on the image in the upper right-hand side of your console, that will direct you to the webpage if you would like to register. As a reminder, if you attended today's presentation in a group and would like to receive CPE credit, you must complete the group attendance sheet found in the slide deck and handouts window. If you participated as an individual and met all certification requirements, your certificate is available to download now in the CPE progress window. I'll keep the webcast console open for a few minutes to give you time to download your certificate, and a copy will be mailed to you within 3 weeks should you have any difficulty downloading it now. Finally, here is a link to a survey for today's presentation. Your feedback is always appreciated. Again, thank you for joining us, and take care, everyone.